It was supposed to be just another gala night in the charming city of Charleston, South Carolina, where magnolias bloom in May and the local elite gather among white columns, long dresses, and sparkling glasses. The Palmetto Historical Society's annual fundraiser was the crown jewel of the spring social calendar, an evening when the city's oldest families showcased their generosity while reinforcing bonds that had lasted generations. But everything changed in 3 minutes. The scent of gardenia centerpieces mingled with expensive perfume as the string quartet played Vivaldi, their notes floating up to the ornate ceiling of the Belmont Hotel's grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over women in designer gowns who laughed politely behind flutes of champagne, their diamond earrings catching the light with every tilt of their heads. Men in tuxedos stood in tight circles, the subtle differences in their attire, a vintage watch, handcrafted shoes, or rare cufflinks, serving as quiet declarations of status among those who could recognize such things. The familiar rhythm of these gatherings, the air kisses, firm handshakes, and conversations that carefully navigated between genuine warmth and strategic networking, was suddenly interrupted. The entire ballroom turned their necks, curious, when a guest in an impeccable yet discreetly elegant suit crossed the main hall. A murmur spread. It wasn't a familiar face. And soon came the glances, the whispers, and finally, the accusation whispered too loudly to be ignored. He was infiltrating. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Lawrence Mitchell, a 58-year-old man with salt and pepper haircut close to his scalp, walked with measured steps across the marble floor. His calm brown eyes took in the room without revealing his thoughts, his posture neither apologetic nor confrontational, simply dignified. The slight tightening around his mouth was the only indication that he noticed how conversations hushed as he passed, the way eyes followed him before quickly darting away when he looked in their direction. He had anticipated this reaction. As CEO of Mitchell Restoration and Development, Lawrence had built his company from nothing into one of the Southeast's most respected historical preservation firms, known for their meticulous attention to detail and commitment to honoring the full history of the buildings they restored. Yet even after 30 years of professional success, he still encountered moments like this. Moments when his presence in certain spaces was viewed with suspicion before anything else. If you're finding this story of quiet dignity in the face of prejudice meaningful, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives that explore the complexities of our shared human experience. Number 1. Lawrence made his way to the bar, where the young bartender's eyes widened slightly before he recovered his professional demeanor. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" "Sparkling water with lime, please," Lawrence said, his voice a rich baritone with the gentle cadence of the Low Country, where his family had lived for 7 generations. As he waited, he felt rather than saw someone approach from his right. "Excuse me," came a woman's voice, sharp with artificial sweetness. "I don't believe we've met." Lawrence turned to find a thin woman in her early 60s, pearls gleaming against her collarbones, her blonde hair swept into an immaculate updo. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, which assessed him with barely concealed suspicion. "Lawrence Mitchell," he replied, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Eleanor Pinckney," she said, taking his hand with just her fingertips before quickly withdrawing. "I'm on the Gala committee. I don't recall seeing your name on our guest list, Mr. Mitchell." The bartender placed Lawrence's drink on the counter, and he thanked him before turning back to Eleanor. "I'm certain it's there, Ms. Pinckney. I received my invitation several weeks ago." Eleanor's smile tightened. "Well, perhaps there's been some misunderstanding. These events are quite exclusive, you understand. By invitation only." Lawrence took a slow sip of his water, the condensation from the glass cool against his fingers. "I understand perfectly." The exchange had drawn attention. Nearby conversations quieted as people strained to hear, their bodies angled toward the developing scene while their eyes pretended interest elsewhere. Lawrence felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation he'd experienced countless times before, the heaviness of being viewed as an intruder rather than a guest, regardless of his accomplishments or invitation. Eleanor's voice dropped to a stage whisper. "I'll need to ask you to show your invitation, or I'm afraid I'll have to call security." Lawrence set his glass down carefully. "Ms. Pinckney, I suggest you check the guest list again. My name is there." Eleanor's cheeks flushed pink. She gestured subtly to a young security guard who had been watching from near the entrance. As he approached, Lawrence noticed a young woman in a server's uniform observing the interaction, her dark eyes concerned behind her horn-rimmed glasses. The guard, who couldn't have been more than 25, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, is there a problem here?" "There's no problem," Lawrence said evenly. "Ms. Pinkney is checking the guest list to confirm my invitation." Eleanor pursed her lips. "I'm quite certain there's been a mistake. We don't usually have unexpected guests at these functions." The security guard shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if you could just show your invitation, we can clear this up quickly." "I left it at home," Lawrence said, his voice betraying no emotion though his heart pounded against his ribs. "But I assure you, my name is on that list." A painful silence fell over their corner of the ballroom. Other guests stared openly now, some with discomfort, others with thinly veiled satisfaction. Lawrence felt sweat gathering at the small of his back beneath his tailored jacket, but his expression remained composed. He had been in this position before, too many times to count, and had promised himself long ago that he would never let them see him lose his composure. Have you ever been in a situation where you were made to feel like you didn't belong? Share your experience in the comments below. How did you handle it, and what did you learn from that moment? Number 2. Just as Eleanor opened her mouth to speak again, the tap of a microphone echoed through the ballroom. All heads turned toward the small stage where Richard Coleman, the president of the Palmetto Historical Society, stood at the podium in his tuxedo, his white hair combed back from his forehead. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 127th Annual Palmetto Historical Society Gala," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate our commitment to preserving Charleston's rich heritage and to raise funds for the restoration of the Hayward Washington House." Lawrence remained where he stood, Eleanor and the security guard still flanking him, all three now caught in an awkward tableau as the speech continued. "Before we proceed with tonight's program, I want to acknowledge our most generous donor, whose contribution has made not only this evening possible but will fund the entirety of the East Wing restoration." Richard scanned the room, his eyes stopping when he spotted Lawrence. A genuine smile spread across his face. "Ah, there he is. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Lawrence Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Restoration and Development, who has pledged $1 million to our cause." The shock was palpable. Eleanor's mouth fell open, her hand fluttering to her throat. The security guard took an instinctive step back. Around the room, expressions ranged from embarrassment to disbelief to genuine mortification. "Lawrence, would you please come up and say a few words?" Richard called, gesturing to the stage. With measured steps, Lawrence made his way through the crowd that now parted before him. He could feel Eleanor's eyes boring into his back, could hear the whispers spreading like wildfire. As he climbed the 3 steps to the stage, he thought of his parents. His father, who had worked as a janitor at the very historical society that now welcomed his son as a benefactor. His mother, who had cleaned the homes of families whose descendants now stood watching him with new eyes. Taking his place at the podium, Lawrence surveyed the sea of faces looking up at him. The moment stretched as he allowed his gaze to move slowly across the room, meeting eyes that now struggled to meet his. "Thank you, Richard," he finally said, his voice steady and warm. "It's an honor to support the work of the Palmetto Historical Society. As someone who has dedicated my life to historical preservation, I believe deeply in the importance of protecting our architectural heritage." He paused, taking a breath that carried the weight of decision. He could make this easy for them, give a brief, gracious speech that would allow everyone to pretend the earlier incident hadn't happened. Or he could speak his truth. But true preservation isn't just about maintaining beautiful buildings. It's about preserving the complete history they represent, including the hands that built them. Many of those hands looked like mine. The silence in the room deepened. Some guests looked down at their champagne glasses, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My great-great-grandfather helped build the very house we're raising funds to restore tonight. He was a skilled craftsman whose name never appeared in any historical records. Tonight, as we celebrate Charleston's heritage, I hope we can commit to preserving not just the facade of our history, but its complete truth, even the parts that make us uncomfortable. Lawrence's eyes found Eleanor in the crowd, and he offered her a small, dignified nod. Because when we acknowledge our full history, we create space for everyone who belongs to it, not as guests or outsiders, but as rightful inheritors of a shared legacy. "Thank you." The applause that followed was tentative at first, then grew stronger, though not everyone joined in. Lawrence shook Richard's hand and returned to the floor, Where some guests approached to introduce themselves, their manner now respectful, even deferential. Others kept their distance, whispering behind programs and flutes of champagne. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. As the evening progressed, Lawrence engaged in polite conversation, discussed preservation techniques with other donors, and even shared a laugh with Richard about a particularly challenging restoration project they'd both worked on years ago. On the surface, the evening had recovered its rhythm. But something had changed, both within Lawrence and in the room around him. A truth had been spoken aloud that could not be unheard. When Lawrence finally left the gala shortly after 11, the night air felt cool against his face. Stars punctuated the clear sky above the historic district, and the scent of jasmine drifted from nearby gardens. He loosened his bow tie as he walked to his car, alone with his thoughts. He didn't see the young server who had witnessed his confrontation with Eleanor following him at a distance, her phone held discreetly at waist level, recording. The morning after the gala, Lawrence sat on the veranda of his home in the Hampton Park Terrace neighborhood, a historic district just north of downtown Charleston. The house was a restored 1920s craftsman bungalow, not as grand as the antebellum mansions south of Broad Street, but beautiful in its solidity and understated elegance, much like Lawrence himself. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he opened the Charleston Post and Courier. He found what he was looking for on page 3, a small article about the gala. The headline read, "Historical Society Gala Raises Record Funds," with a subheading that mentioned his donation. Near the end of the article was a single sentence that made his jaw tighten. The evening proceeded with the traditional Southern charm and hospitality for which Charleston is known. Lawrence set the paper down with a sigh. The whitewashing had begun already. The reporter had been present, had witnessed the entire incident, yet chose to erase it from the public record. Just as his great-great-grandfather's contributions had been erased from the history of the Hayward Washington house. His phone rang, displaying his assistant Marla's number. "Good morning, Marla," he answered. "Lawrence, have you seen the video?" Her voice was tense, unusual for his typically unflappable assistant of 15 years. "What video?" "It's all over social media. Someone recorded what happened last night at the gala, that woman questioning you, the security guard. It's gone viral." Lawrence's heart sank. "How bad is it?" "It's actually quite powerful," Marla said. "They caught everything, including your speech afterward. People are sharing it everywhere. You need to see it." He ended the call and immediately searched for the video. It didn't take long to find. It had already accumulated hundreds of thousands of views across multiple platforms. The footage began just as Eleanor approached him at the bar, captured from a low angle that suggested the person recording had been trying to be discreet. The video showed everything: Eleanor's condescension, the security guard's arrival, the uncomfortable stares from other guests. Then came Richard's announcement, the shock on Eleanor's face, and finally, Lawrence's measured, dignified response at the podium. The caption read, "Watch how this black business owner responds to being racially profiled at his own event." Lawrence set down his phone, emotions warring within him. On one hand, he had spent his life avoiding public confrontation, believing that excellence was the best response to prejudice. He had built his business on the principle that the quality of his work would speak for itself. He had carefully cultivated relationships in Charleston's business community by never making anyone uncomfortable about race. But watching the video, seeing the naked prejudice displayed so plainly, he felt something shift inside him. Perhaps his silence had not served him, or his community, as well as he had thought. His phone began to ring incessantly. Local news stations, business associates, community leaders, even old friends he hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know his thoughts, his feelings, his plans in response to becoming, overnight, the center of a viral moment that had captured the nation's attention. Lawrence silenced his phone and closed his eyes, listening to the morning birds and distant traffic. He needed time to think, to decide who he wanted to be in this unexpected spotlight. The choice before him was clear. He could minimize what had happened, accept Eleanor's inevitable apology, allow everyone to move on with the comfortable fiction that this had been an isolated incident rather than a symptom of something deeper. Or he could use this moment to speak truths that had gone unspoken for too long in the circles he had worked so hard to enter. If you're appreciating this story about finding the courage to speak truth to power, please hit the subscribe button to support more content that explores the complexities of racial dynamics in America. Your support makes these important narratives possible. Number 3. 3 days after the gala, Lawrence sat in the sun-drenched sitting room of Magnolia Pines, a retirement community on the outskirts of Charleston. Across from him, in a worn leather armchair, sat Dr. Walter Freeman, his former professor and mentor from Howard University. At 86, Walter's once imposing frame had grown thin, but his eyes remained sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his mind was as incisive as ever. "They're saying you planned it," Walter said, a hint of amusement in his voice as he set down his cup of tea. "That you deliberately didn't show your invitation to create a scene." Lawrence shook his head. "You know that's not true." "Of course I know," Walter replied. "But it's easier for them to believe you orchestrated it than to admit what actually happened." The sitting room smelled of lemon polish and old books. Afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns on the hardwood floor. From somewhere in the building came the gentle notes of a piano, someone playing Debussy with practiced hands. "I've been invited to appear on morning shows, to give interviews," Lawrence said. "The Historical Society has issued a formal apology. Eleanor Pinckney sent flowers with a note saying she's deeply sorry for the misunderstanding." Walter snorted. "Misunderstanding? Is that what they're calling it now?" "What would you call it?" "I'd call it what it is," Walter said simply. "But the question isn't what I would call it. The question is what you're going to do about it." Lawrence leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision he'd been avoiding for days. "I built my business by being non-confrontational, Walter. By letting my work speak for itself. If I become that guy, the one who talks about racism at dinner parties, I risk everything I've built." "And if you stay silent?" Walter challenged. "What do you risk then?" The question hung in the air between them. Outside the window, a mockingbird sang its complex melody, repeating phrases with virtuosic precision. Walter leaned forward, his expression softening. "You remember what I taught you in your first year at Howard? About Du Bois and the talented tenth?" Lawrence nodded. "That those of us who achieve success have a responsibility to use our position to uplift others." "Exactly," Walter said. "You've earned your seat at the table, Lawrence. Now you have to decide what you're going to do with it." Lawrence thought of his parents, both gone now. His father, who had worked 2 jobs to send him to college. His mother, who had instilled in him the importance of dignity in the face of disrespect. What would they want him to do with this unexpected platform? "I don't want to be defined by this moment," Lawrence admitted. "To have my entire career reduced to being that black man who was profiled at the gala." Walter's laugh was gentle but firm. "Lawrence, you think you get to choose how the world defines you. You've never had that luxury. None of us have." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "But you do get to choose how you respond. And sometimes, in that response, we find our true purpose." As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the room in golden hues, Walter shared stories of his own battles for dignity during the civil rights era, how he had marched with King, how he had integrated the philosophy department at a prestigious Southern university, how he had mentored generations of black scholars, including Lawrence himself. "Sometimes it's not our name that needs to be remembered," Walter said as Lawrence prepared to leave, "but our posture. The way we stood in difficult moments. That's what inspires others to stand tall too." The scent of orange blossoms drifted through the open window, and in the distance, church bells rang out the hour. Lawrence embraced his mentor, drawing strength from the frail but still powerful man who had helped shape his life's direction once before. As he drove home through Charleston's historic streets, past buildings his company had restored and others that still awaited care, Lawrence made his decision. He would not hide from this moment. He would step fully into it, whatever the cost. Have you ever had a mentor who helped you find courage during a difficult time? Share your story in the comments below about someone who helped you stand in your truth. Number 4. The following week brought challenges Lawrence had never anticipated. His inbox flooded with messages, some supportive, others viciously racist. News vans parked outside his office, reporters shouting questions whenever he came or went. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag 3 minutes of dignity, hashtag I stand with Lawrence, and on the darker side, hashtag gatecrashers aren't guests. He had agreed to one interview with a respected local journalist, Diane Washington, who had covered Charleston's complex race relations for decades. They sat in his office, where African art pieces shared space with architectural drawings and historic preservation awards. The walls were painted a warm terracotta, the furniture was solid cherry wood, and large windows overlooked Hampton Park's lush greenery. "Mr. Mitchell, you've been largely silent since the video went viral," Diane began, her recorder between them on the coffee table. "Why speak now?" Lawrence measured his words carefully. "I needed time to think about what this moment means, not just for me, but for our community." "And what have you concluded?" "That silence hasn't served us as well as we thought," he said. "For years, many of us believed that if we worked twice as hard, if we were beyond reproach in our conduct, if we never made anyone uncomfortable by mentioning race, we would eventually be accepted as equals. But that night at the gala proved what many of us have always known, that no amount of achievement fully protects you from prejudice." The interview continued for over an hour, with Lawrence sharing not only his experience at the gala but similar incidents throughout his life and career, being followed in high-end stores, having clients request to speak to the owner even after he'd introduced himself as such, watching less qualified competitors win contracts because they fit better with the client's vision. When the article was published 2 days later, the response was immediate and polarizing. Many praised his honesty and courage, others accused him of exaggeration or opportunism. What Lawrence hadn't expected was the call from Gerald Whitaker, head of the Charleston Business Leaders Council and an influential member of the Historical Society's board. "Lawrence, we need to talk," Gerald said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "This situation is getting out of hand. The Society's reputation is suffering, donors are threatening to withdraw support, and Eleanor Pinckney is beside herself." They met at Gerald's Club, an exclusive establishment in a converted rice plantation manor. Portraits of founding members, all white men in formal attire, lined the wood-paneled walls of the private dining room where Gerald waited, a glass of bourbon already half empty beside his right hand. Gerald was in his 60s, with the ruddy complexion of a man who enjoyed good food and strong drink. His gray hair was expensively cut, his navy blazer tailored to minimize his growing paunch. He stood as Lawrence entered, offering a handshake that was firm but brief. "I've drafted a joint statement," Gerald said without preamble once they were seated. He slid a folder across the table. "It acknowledges a regrettable misunderstanding at the gala and affirms both the Historical Society's commitment to inclusivity and your continued support of their mission." Lawrence opened the folder and scanned the document, its carefully crafted language designed to soothe without acknowledging any actual wrongdoing. The statement positioned the incident as an anomaly rather than a symptom of systemic problems. "This isn't accurate, Gerald," Lawrence said quietly, closing the folder. Gerald's face flushed darker. "It's diplomatic. It allows everyone to save face and move forward. By pretending the problem doesn't exist. By not turning a single unpleasant incident into a referendum on race relations in Charleston." Gerald's voice rose before he caught himself, glancing toward the door. He continued more quietly, "Lawrence, you've built a wonderful business. You're respected in this community. Don't throw that away over one woman's poor judgment." Lawrence studied the man across from him, someone he'd worked with for years, had even considered a friend of sorts. "What about the West Side Community Center renovation?" Gerald blinked, momentarily confused by the change in topic. "What about it?" "My firm has been working pro bono on plans to restore it for the past year. We were just waiting on the council's final approval to begin." Understanding dawned in Gerald's eyes. "If you pursue this course of action, this crusade, I can't guarantee the council will continue to support that project." The threat was clear. Sign the statement or lose the project that would provide a desperately needed community space in one of Charleston's historically black neighborhoods. Lawrence felt a heaviness settle in his chest, the familiar weight of compromise. How many times had he swallowed his truth to maintain relationships, to keep doors open, to ensure his business could thrive? The calculation had always seemed worth it. Small indignities traded for greater opportunities to make a difference. But sitting across from Gerald, seeing the smug certainty in the other man's eyes that Lawrence would eventually fold, something hardened within him. "I won't be signing this, Gerald." He stood, straightening his jacket. "And if the council chooses to withdraw support for the West Side Center because of my refusal to pretend racism doesn't exist in Charleston, that will say far more about the council than it does about me." As Lawrence walked out of the club, past the portraits of men who had once owned people who looked like him, he felt both lighter and heavier than before. He had just sacrificed a project he deeply believed in. But he had kept something more valuable: his integrity. If you're finding value in this exploration of the personal cost of standing up for what's right, please take a moment to like and subscribe to support more stories that examine these complex moral choices. Your engagement helps these important narratives reach a wider audience. Number 5. The Charleston sun beat down mercilessly as Lawrence climbed the worn steps of Gethsemane Baptist Church, one of the oldest black churches in the city. The historic building had stood since 1865, built by formerly enslaved people who had pooled their meager resources to create a sanctuary of their own. Its simple beauty always moved Lawrence. The handcrafted pews, the stained glass windows created by local artisans, the pulpit carved from cypress wood salvaged after the Civil War. He had come seeking both solace and perspective, but found himself instead in an impromptu meeting with Reverend James Haywood and several community leaders who had gathered to discuss the growing controversy. They sat in the church's meeting room, ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead, glasses of sweet tea sweating on the table between them. "The Business Council pulled funding for the West Side Center this morning," said Darlene Jackson, a city council member representing Charleston's predominantly black East Side neighborhood. Her voice was tight with anger. "They're claiming budget constraints, but the timing makes their real reason obvious." "We expected this," Lawrence replied, though the confirmation still stung. A project that would have provided after-school programs, job training, and community gathering space for a neighborhood that desperately needed it. Gone because he refused to sign a statement denying his lived experience. "The question is, what do we do now?" asked Marcus Bradley, principal of Burke High School. "This center would have given our students somewhere safe to go after school." Lawrence took a slow sip of his tea, the sweetness momentarily cutting through the bitterness of the situation. "I'll fund it myself." The room fell silent. "Lawrence," Reverend Haywood said gently, "that's a $3 million project." "I'm aware of the cost," Lawrence replied. "It will stretch my resources thin, but I can manage it." "You shouldn't have to carry this alone," Darlene protested. "I'm not doing it alone," Lawrence said. "I'll provide the funding, but I'll need all of you to help with implementation, programming, community outreach. This will be a true community effort, just without the strings the Business Council would have attached." As they discussed logistics, Lawrence felt a growing sense of purpose. This was no longer about one humiliating incident at a gala. It was about addressing the systemic inequities that had shaped Charleston for generations. When the meeting concluded 2 hours later, plans were in place not just for the community center, but for a broader initiative to document and address disparities in how Charleston's history was presented to visitors and students. The Gullah Geechee cultural contributions, the skilled craftsmanship of enslaved artisans who built much of historic Charleston, the thriving black business districts that had existed before urban renewal projects decimated them, all would be researched, documented, and incorporated into educational materials. Lawrence left the church feeling energized despite the challenges ahead. But that energy drained quickly when he checked his phone to find a voicemail from his largest client, a luxury hotel chain that had contracted his firm to restore 5 historic properties across the South. "Mr. Mitchell," the message began formally, though the CEO had called him Lawrence for years, "in light of recent events, we feel it would be best to put our projects on hold while we reassess our restoration partnerships. We'll be in touch once this situation has resolved itself." Lawrence sat in his car, the air conditioning doing little to combat the heat that seemed to radiate from within him. 5 projects, representing nearly half his company's projected revenue for the year gone. And with them, potentially the livelihoods of dozens of employees who depended on him. For the first time since the gala, doubt crept in. Was he being selfish, putting his own pride above the welfare of his team? Was his stand for dignity worth the cost others might have to pay? He called Marla, his voice tight as he explained the situation. "We need to look at our financials, see how long we can maintain payroll if we don't replace these contracts quickly." "I'm already on it," Marla assured him, her calm competence a balm to his frayed nerves. "And Lawrence, the team is with you. Everyone's seen the video. They understand what this is about." That evening, Lawrence sat alone on his porch, watching fireflies rise from his garden as darkness fell. The scent of Carolina jasmine hung heavy in the humid air, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird continued its tireless song. He thought of his father, who had sometimes worked 18-hour days without complaint, of his mother who had taught him that dignity wasn't something others could give or take away. It was something you claimed for yourself, every day, through your actions and choices. His phone chimed with a text message. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but the content made his breath catch. "Mr. Mitchell, you don't know me, but I work at the Belmont Hotel. I was there that night. What they did to you happens to people like us all the time there, but nobody ever sees it. Thank you for not backing down. You're speaking for all of us." As Lawrence read and reread the message, the weight of responsibility settled more firmly on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore, if it ever had been. It was about all the people who suffered these indignities in silence, who didn't have the platform or resources to challenge them. He made a decision then, sitting among the fireflies and jasmine. Whatever the cost, he would see this through. Have you ever had to choose between what was easy and what was right? Share your experience in the comments below. What helped you make your decision, and would you make the same choice again? Number 6. The next morning brought another blow. Lawrence arrived at his office to find Marla waiting with a grim expression. The Charleston Heritage Commission had just announced they were reviewing all of Mitchell Restoration's ongoing projects in the historic district, citing concerns about adherence to preservation guidelines. "This is retaliation," Lawrence said, scanning the official letter. "We've never had a single citation for guidelines violations in 25 years." "Of course it's retaliation," Marla agreed, her usually perfect composure slipping to reveal genuine anger. "They can't directly admit they're punishing you for speaking out, so they're finding indirect ways to apply pressure." Throughout the day, the pressure mounted. 3 more clients called to postpone projects. A scheduled speaking engagement at a preservation conference was abruptly canceled. Even the local business journal, which had featured Lawrence on its cover just months earlier, published an editorial questioning whether certain professionals were exploiting social tensions for publicity. Lawrence maintained his calm demeanor through it all, but by late afternoon, sitting alone in his office, the weight became overwhelming. On his desk sat photographs of projects his company had completed over the years. Historic homes restored to their original beauty, community buildings brought back from the brink of collapse, landmarks preserved for future generations. Beside them stood a picture of his parents on their 40th wedding anniversary, their faces lined with age but shining with pride as they stood with their only son. "What would you do, Dad?" Lawrence whispered to the photograph. "How do you stand your ground when the cost keeps rising?" His father had been a man of few words but deep conviction. After being denied a promotion at the Historical Society despite over 20 years of service, he had simply nodded, continued to do his work with excellence, and focused on ensuring his son would have opportunities he never did. He had never spoken of the injustice, had never demanded recognition. Was that dignified silence or painful resignation? For the first time, Lawrence found himself questioning the example he had followed all his life. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Walter, his mentor, leaning on a cane but standing straight-backed in the doorway. "They told me you were busy," Walter said, "but I figured that was just assistant speak for he's having an existential crisis and staring out the window." Despite everything, Lawrence laughed. "What are you doing here, Walter? You shouldn't be driving across town in this heat." "I had my neighbor bring me," Walter said, lowering himself carefully into a chair. "And I came because I've been where you are, caught between what's comfortable and what's right." The air conditioning hummed softly as Lawrence poured water for both of them, the glass cool against his palm. Outside his window, Charleston carried on, tourists in sensible shoes photographing historic facades, horse-drawn carriages clip-clopping down cobblestone streets, the guided tours that shared carefully curated versions of the city's past. "They're trying to destroy everything I've built," Lawrence admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. Walter sipped his water thoughtfully. "Let me tell you a story I've never shared with you. In 1967, I was offered a position as the first black professor in the philosophy department at Vanderbilt. A historic opportunity. But 2 weeks before I was to start, the department chair called me into his office and explained that while they were committed to integration, it would be best if I focused my research on African philosophy rather than Western philosophical traditions." Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "What did you do?" "I declined the position," Walter said simply. "I'd spent my academic career studying Kant and Hegel. I wasn't going to be pigeonholed because of my race." He set down his glass with a soft clink. "I thought I'd committed career suicide. 3 universities that had previously expressed interest suddenly had no suitable openings." My white colleagues called me foolish for letting pride get in the way of progress. But you eventually became department chair at Howard, Lawrence said. Walter nodded. Because I refused to be less than I was. 6 months after I declined Vanderbilt, Howard recruited me specifically because they'd heard about my stand. And from that position, I was able to mentor hundreds of students, including you. He leaned forward, his aged eyes intense. If I had accepted those limitations, if I had been grateful just to have a seat at the table, even if it was in the corner, how many lives would have been different? How many doors would have remained closed? The question hung in the air between them as afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams. I might lose everything, Lawrence said quietly. You might, Walter acknowledged without flinching. Or you might gain something greater than what you had before. Either way, you'll know you stood in your truth. There's a power in that, Lawrence, that no one can take from you. As evening shadows lengthened across the office, the two men talked of courage and compromise, of battles chosen and battles deferred. Walter shared stories of the civil rights era that he had never told before. Not the sanitized versions suitable for classrooms, but the raw, painful realities of standing for dignity in a world determined to deny it. When Walter finally rose to leave, the weight on Lawrence's shoulders felt different. Not lighter, perhaps, but more purposeful. The cost of his stand remained high, but the cost of surrender had become unthinkable. As the sun set over Charleston, painting the historic spires in hues of gold and pink, Lawrence made a series of calls, to his attorney, to his financial advisor, to key members of his team. If the powers of Charleston thought economic pressure would silence him, they had profoundly misunderstood the man they were dealing with. He had not built his company from nothing by backing down when challenged. Tomorrow would bring a new strategy, not of retreat, but of advance. The story of what happened at the Palmetto Historical Society Gala continued to spread, but now it was being shaped by forces beyond Lawrence's control. Local news stations aired balanced perspectives that presented Eleanor Pinckney as misunderstood and suggested Lawrence was playing the race card to gain publicity. Online forums filled with heated debates about whether the incident reflected racism or just an understandable security concern. 2 weeks after the gala, Lawrence sat in the office of Aisha Davis, a journalist known for her unflinching examination of social issues. Unlike the sanitized coverage from local media, Aisha had spent days investigating, interviewing staff members who had witnessed similar incidents at the Belmont Hotel, and digging through historical records of the Palmetto Historical Society. Her small office at the independent weekly The Charleston Voice was cluttered with books, newspapers, and sticky notes. A box fan whirred in the corner, barely making a dent in the oppressive heat that had settled over the city. Outside, a summer thunderstorm was brewing, dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Mr. Mitchell, what you experienced wasn't an isolated incident, Aisha said, spreading photographs across her desk. I've documented 17 similar occurrences at society events over the past 5 years. Black guests being asked for ID when white guests weren't, being directed to service entrances, being questioned about their presence. Lawrence examined the images, screenshots from social media posts, cell phone photos, even security camera footage that a sympathetic employee had provided. Each told a similar story to his own. And it gets worse, Aisha continued, her voice tightening. I've been reviewing their guest lists for the past decade. Despite Charleston's population being approximately 30% black, attendance at society events rarely includes more than 2 to 3% black guests, and those are primarily public officials or celebrities who can't be easily excluded. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Lawrence absorbed this information. They'll claim it's about donations, not race. That their events cater to major donors, who happen to be predominantly white. I thought of that, Aisha said, sliding another folder toward him. So I cross-referenced their invitation lists with tax records. There are dozens of black business owners and professionals in Charleston with comparable or greater wealth than many white attendees who never receive invitations. The evidence was damning, a pattern of exclusion so consistent it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Lawrence felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. His experience hadn't been unique or imagined. It had been part of a systemic problem that had persisted for years, largely invisible to those who didn't experience it directly. I'm publishing my findings next week, Aisha said. I wanted you to see them first, to be prepared for the response. What response do you expect? Denial? Deflection? Personal attacks on your character and mine. Aisha's determination was evident in the set of her jaw. Powerful institutions don't change without resistance, Mr. Mitchell. They'll fight to maintain the status quo. As if on cue, Lawrence's phone rang. It was Gerald Whittaker from the Business Council. Lawrence excused himself and stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Lawrence, things have gone too far," Gerald said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This crusade of yours is damaging the reputation of some of Charleston's most respected institutions and families." "I'm not on a crusade, Gerald. I'm simply refusing to pretend that what happened to me was an isolated incident. Do you have any idea what you're doing to Eleanor? She's received threats. Her daughter's wedding next month is being boycotted by half the guests. All because of a simple misunderstanding that you've blown completely out of proportion." Lawrence closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it all, the expectation that he should bear the burden of racism quietly, that he should protect the feelings of those who had humiliated him, that his dignity was less important than social harmony. "I'm sorry to hear about the threats," he said honestly. "No one deserves that, including Eleanor. But characterizing what happened as a simple misunderstanding is exactly the problem, Gerald. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination, and it's been happening at society events for years." "That's absurd," Gerald sputtered. "The society has always— I've seen the evidence, Gerald. Documented incidents, invitation patterns, everything. And soon, everyone else will see it too." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Gerald spoke again, his voice now dangerously quiet. "You really want to do this? Burn bridges with everyone who matters in this town? Because I promise you, Lawrence, if you continue down this path, you'll never work in Charleston again." The threat hung in the air, explicit now rather than implied. Lawrence thought of his company, of the employees who depended on him, of the projects that brought historic buildings back to life. He thought of his parents, of Walter, of the young hotel worker who had texted him with gratitude for speaking up. "If everyone who matters in Charleston is committed to maintaining systems of exclusion, then perhaps it's time to redefine who matters," Lawrence replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "Goodbye, Gerald." He ended the call and stood for a moment in the empty hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Through the window at the end of the corridor, he could see the storm clouds growing darker, feel the pressure dropping as thunder rumbled closer. Charleston was in for a downpour. When he returned to Aisha's office, she looked up expectantly. "Everything okay?" "No," Lawrence said honestly. "But it will be." As the first heavy raindrops began to pelt the windows, they discussed the article's publication and what would likely follow. By the time Lawrence left, the storm had broken in earnest, rain sheeting down in silver curtains that transformed Charleston's historic streets into glistening rivers. He drove home slowly, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. At home, the power had gone out. Lawrence lit candles and sat in his darkened living room, listening to the symphony of the storm. Rain hammering on the roof, wind whistling through the oak trees, thunder rolling across the sky. In the flickering candlelight, he felt strangely peaceful despite standing at the edge of what might be the greatest professional crisis of his life. If you've been moved by Lawrence's journey and the difficult choices he's making, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories about moral courage and the fight for dignity in the face of systemic challenges. Number 7, 3 days later, the Charleston Voice published Aisha's investigation under the headline, "Beyond 3 Minutes, a Pattern of Exclusion at Charleston's Elite Events." The article meticulously documented what many in Charleston's black community had known for years but had rarely seen acknowledged publicly, that the city's most prestigious social and charitable institutions systematically excluded black Charlestonians, regardless of their achievements or contributions to the community. The response was swift and divided. Many white Charlestonians dismissed the article as inflammatory and one-sided. Black residents and younger progressives shared it widely, adding their own experiences. Local television news covered it as a controversy, carefully balancing perspectives as though documented discrimination and denial of that discrimination deserved equal weight. For Lawrence, the most immediate impact came in the form of a certified letter from his bank, calling in loans that had been used to finance the expansion of his business 3 years earlier. The letter cited concerns about financial stability, despite the company's perfect payment record and strong financial position. It was the lowest blow yet, a direct threat not just to Lawrence's future projects but to the continued existence of his company. Without those loans, he would be forced to liquidate assets, lay off staff, and potentially close the business he had spent 3 decades building. That evening, Lawrence called an emergency meeting with his executive team in the company's conference room. Maps of historic Charleston covered one wall, alongside framed photographs of their most significant restoration projects. The people gathered around the table, diverse in age, gender, and ethnicity, represented the leadership that had helped build Mitchell Restoration into an industry leader. "I won't sugarcoat this," Lawrence began, placing the bank's letter on the table. "We're facing an orchestrated attempt to force us out of business." He explained the situation in detail: the called loans, the canceled contracts, the Heritage Commission's review of their projects. The faces around the table grew increasingly sober as the full picture emerged. "They can't do this," said Robert Chen, the company's chief financial officer. "The loan terms don't allow them to call it in without cause." "They've manufactured a cause," Lawrence replied. "And fighting it in court would take years we don't have." Denise Washington, head of the Restoration Division and a third-generation craftsperson whose grandfather had worked as a plasterer in Charleston's historic homes, leaned forward. "What are our options?" Lawrence outlined 3 possibilities. They could attempt to secure emergency financing from another bank, though that would be difficult given the current climate. They could sell assets to cover the loans, which would mean significant downsizing, or they could seek an investor or buyer for the company. "There's a 4th option," said James Rodriguez, their legal counsel. "We fight. We file complaints with regulatory agencies about discriminatory banking practices. We go public with what they're doing. We make it clear that this is retaliation for speaking out about racism." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Fighting would mean escalation, turning what was already a difficult situation into an all-out war with some of Charleston's most powerful institutions. "Before we decide," Lawrence said carefully, "I want to make something clear. This began with me and my experience at the Gala. Each of you has families, mortgages, children in college. If we downsize or sell, I'll ensure everyone receives generous severance and placement help. No one would blame you for wanting to protect your livelihoods." Denise was the first to respond, her voice firm despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "My grandfather wasn't allowed through the front doors of the homes he helped restore. He had to enter through service entrances, even when he came to repair his own work." She straightened in her chair. "I've spent my career walking through front doors because of people like you who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. I vote we fight." One by one, the others voiced their support, not without concerns and questions about the practical implications, but with a clear understanding that the principle at stake transcended business considerations. As the meeting concluded, Robert stayed behind. Once they were alone, he placed a hand on Lawrence's shoulder. "You've been carrying this alone for too long. Let us help." Lawrence nodded, throat tight with emotion he couldn't express. From the beginning, he had viewed this as his personal battle, his burden to bear. The realization that others were willing to stand with him, to risk their own security for the principles he embodied, was both humbling and strengthening. Over the next few days, the company implemented their response strategy. They filed formal complaints with banking regulators alleging discriminatory practices. They reached out to national media to share the broader story of retaliation. They accelerated work on current projects while seeking new clients outside of Charleston, businesses and organizations that would value their expertise without the political entanglements. The pressure continued to mount. Anonymous negative reviews appeared online. Suppliers delayed deliveries. Subcontractors suddenly became unavailable. Each day brought new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But something unexpected was happening as well. For every client who withdrew, another stepped forward, often from unexpected quarters. A historically black church in Savannah reached out about restoring their 19th-century building. A university in North Carolina wanted to discuss renovating campus structures built by enslaved laborers, with an emphasis on honoring their craftsmanship. A museum in Atlanta expressed interest in having Mitchell Restoration create exhibits that accurately portrayed the contributions of black artisans to Southern architecture. Most surprisingly, several longtime clients privately expressed their support, continuing their projects despite pressure to cut ties. My family has worked with yours for 15 years, one elderly client told Lawrence. I know your character. I know your work. The rest is just noise. As the third week after the gala began, Lawrence received a call from an unexpected source. Eleanor Pinckney, the woman whose actions had set everything in motion. Mr. Mitchell, her voice was hesitant on the phone, I was wondering if you might be willing to meet with me. Privately. Lawrence hesitated, unsure of her motives. Was this another attempt to pressure him into signing some statement that would minimize what had happened? I understand your reluctance, Eleanor continued when he didn't immediately respond. But I'm not calling as a representative of the society or with anyone else's knowledge. This is personal. Something in her voice, a vulnerability he hadn't heard before, made Lawrence agree to the meeting. They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in North Charleston, away from downtown's watchful eyes. The coffee shop was sparsely populated when Lawrence arrived. Sunlight streamed through windows framed by simple cotton curtains, illuminating wooden tables and mismatched chairs. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and soft jazz played over speakers mounted in the corners. Eleanor was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked different from the gala, older somehow, and less certain. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple blouse and slacks, her elaborate updo exchanged for a simple bob that revealed streaks of gray she usually colored. As Lawrence approached, she looked up, her expression a complex mixture of anxiety and determination. She didn't offer her hand, seeming unsure of the appropriate greeting. Thank you for coming, she said as he sat across from her. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, Lawrence replied honestly. A young barista approached, and Lawrence ordered a black coffee. When she left, silence fell between them, the weight of everything that had happened making small talk impossible. I owe you an apology, Eleanor finally said, her voice quiet but clear. Not the kind that was in that note with the flowers. That was written by the society's PR team. A real apology. Lawrence watched her carefully, saying nothing. What I did to you at the gala was inexcusable, she continued. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't about security concerns. It was. She paused, seeming to struggle with the word. It was prejudice. Plain and simple. The admission hung in the air between them. Outside, a city bus rumbled past, momentarily drowning out the jazz music. I've spent my entire life in Charleston society, Eleanor continued. I was raised to believe certain things about how the world works, about who belongs where. I never questioned it because I never had to. Her fingers tightened around her mug. When I saw you at the gala, I acted on autopilot. I saw someone who didn't fit my mental image of who should be there, and I tried to remove the anomaly. The barista returned with Lawrence's coffee, temporarily pausing the conversation. He took a sip, the bitter liquid hot against his tongue. Why are you telling me this? He asked when they were alone again. Eleanor met his eyes directly for the first time. Because I need you to know that I understand what I did. That I'm not hiding behind excuses anymore. And because... Her voice wavered slightly, because I want to change. Not just apologize, but actually do better. Lawrence had expected many things from this meeting, another attempt at damage control, perhaps, or a plea to help restore her reputation. Genuine remorse hadn't been on the list of possibilities. I've started a committee, Eleanor continued when he didn't respond. For diversity and inclusion at the Historical Society. Real inclusion, not just tokenism. We're reviewing our invitation practices, our hiring, our board composition, everything. I'd like you to consider being an advisor, though I completely understand if you refuse. Why now? Lawrence asked. Is it because of the article? The public pressure? Eleanor looked down at her hands. Partly, she admitted. I won't pretend the public exposure wasn't a wake-up call. But it's also because my granddaughter refused to speak to me after she saw that video. She's 19, a sophomore at College of Charleston. She told me she was ashamed to be related to me. Her voice broke slightly. That hit harder than any newspaper article could. The pain in her voice was genuine, Lawrence could hear that. But he remained cautious. Change isn't easy, Ms. Pinckney. Especially when it challenges beliefs you've held your entire life. "I know," she nodded. "I'm not expecting trust or forgiveness. I haven't earned either. I just want a chance to do better, to be better." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "This is our preliminary plan for the Inclusion Committee. I'd appreciate your thoughts, whether or not you choose to be formally involved." Lawrence accepted the folder but didn't open it. "I'll review it," he promised. "That's all I can commit to right now." "That's more than I deserve," Eleanor said quietly. As their meeting concluded, Lawrence found himself in uncharted territory. He had prepared for continued opposition, for escalation, for the long fight ahead. He hadn't prepared for the possibility of genuine change, however small or uncertain. Walking back to his car under the bright Charleston sun, past historic buildings whose beauty had always been complicated by the knowledge of who had built them and under what conditions, Lawrence felt the first tentative stirrings of something he hadn't expected to find in this battle: hope. Have you ever received an apology that surprised you with its sincerity? Or have you had to offer one that was difficult but necessary? Share your experience in the comments below. How did it change your relationship? Number 8. The following afternoon, Lawrence stood before a packed auditorium at Burke High School, Charleston's oldest public school serving predominantly black students. Students filled every seat, their faces upturned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration to skepticism. Teachers and parents lined the walls, and local media had set up cameras at the back of the room. Lawrence had been invited to speak about his experiences and the broader issues they represented, an opportunity to speak directly to young people who were forming their own identities and understanding of the world. The weight of this responsibility settled on his shoulders as he surveyed the audience, particularly the teenagers who reminded him so much of himself at their age. The auditorium was stuffy despite ceiling fans that stirred the warm air. Afternoon sunlight slanted through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams. The wooden stage creaked slightly beneath Lawrence's feet as he adjusted the microphone. 3 minutes, he began, his voice resonating through the sound system. That's how long it took at the gala before someone questioned my right to be there. 3 minutes that changed everything. He recounted the incident without embellishment, describing the looks, the whispers, the confrontation, and the revelation. The students listened intently, many nodding in recognition of experiences all too familiar. "But this isn't just about one night or one incident," Lawrence continued. "It's about patterns that persist, systems that exclude, and the choices we make when confronted with injustice." For the next hour, Lawrence shared not just the story that had made headlines, but the lifetime of experiences that had preceded it, the subtle and not-so-subtle barriers he had encountered, the compromises he had made, the successes he had achieved despite the obstacles. He spoke of his parents' influence, of Walter's mentorship, of the principles that had guided his life and career. "Throughout my life, I've tried to let my work speak for itself," he said. "I believed that excellence was the best response to prejudice. And in many ways, that approach served me well. But I've come to realize it also had costs. By remaining silent about the discrimination I experienced, I may have made it easier for that discrimination to continue for others." A girl in the front row raised her hand, and Lawrence paused to acknowledge her. "But speaking up has costs too, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice clear and confident despite her youth. "You've lost business. People are attacking you. Was it worth it?" The question hung in the air, direct and challenging. Lawrence appreciated her forthrightness. "That's the question I ask myself every day," he admitted. "And I don't have a perfect answer. What I know is this: dignity isn't negotiable. Once you start compromising it, there's no clear line where the compromises stop." Another student raised his hand. "My dad says you're making things worse by turning it into a racial issue. That you should have just shown your invitation and avoided all this drama." Lawrence nodded, acknowledging the perspective without dismissing it. "Many people feel that way. They believe harmony is more important than confronting uncomfortable truths. And I respect their right to that opinion. But ask yourself this: who benefits from silence? Who benefits when we pretend problems don't exist?" As the discussion continued, Lawrence was struck by the students' engagement, their thoughtful questions, their willingness to grapple with complex issues, their hunger for honest conversation. These young people didn't want platitudes or simple answers. They wanted authentic dialogue about the world they were inheriting and their power to shape it. When a teacher finally indicated that time was running short, Lawrence offered some closing thoughts. I can't tell you what choices you should make when you face injustice. Those decisions are deeply personal and depend on countless factors: your circumstances, your resources, your support systems. What I can tell you is that your dignity is innate and non-negotiable. How you defend it may vary, but that it deserves defending is beyond question. As the event concluded, students surged forward to speak with him individually. A tall boy with close-cropped hair and serious eyes waited patiently until others had their turn. "Mr. Mitchell," he said when he finally stood before Lawrence, "I'm Marcus Williams. I'm interning at Mitchell Restoration this summer." He straightened his shoulders. "I just wanted to say that even if you lose every contract in Charleston, what you're doing matters. It shows people like me that we don't have to choose between success and self-respect." Lawrence felt a tightness in his throat as he shook the young man's hand. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know." As Lawrence left the school, stepping into the late afternoon sunlight, his phone buzzed with a notification. The Charleston Business Journal had published an opinion piece by several prominent local executives condemning the weaponization of social media and warning about the dangers of rushing to judgment. Though it didn't mention Lawrence by name, the target was clear. Alongside this digital attack came a more personal one. His social media accounts were flooded with messages questioning his motives, his character, his very right to speak about his experiences. Anonymous accounts accused him of playing the victim and stirring up trouble for publicity. Some messages crossed the line into explicit racism and threats. Sitting in his car in the school parking lot, Lawrence felt the full weight of it all: the support and the backlash, the progress and the resistance, the personal toll of becoming a reluctant symbol in a struggle he had never sought. For a moment, the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. Was it worth it? The question the student had asked echoed in his mind. His company was at risk. His reputation was under attack. The stress was taking a physical toll. He wasn't sleeping well, wasn't eating properly, felt constantly on edge. Yet alongside these doubts came the memory of Marcus Williams' words, of the young people who had listened so intently, of the hotel worker's text message, of Walter's unwavering support. Whatever the personal cost, something important was happening. Conversations that had been confined to private spaces were now taking place publicly. People who had suffered in silence were finding their voices. Systems that had operated unchallenged for generations were being questioned. Lawrence started his car, the air conditioning a relief against the Charleston heat. He had one more stop to make before the day was done, a meeting that might determine whether Mitchell Restoration had a future in the city he called home. If this story resonates with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button to support more narratives that explore complex social issues with nuance and depth. Your engagement helps these important stories reach those who need to hear them. Number 9. The Calhoun Street Theater had stood in Charleston since 1850, its Greek Revival facade a testament to the city's architectural heritage. Once the cultural center of the city's elite, it had fallen into disrepair in the mid-20th century as suburban flight and changing entertainment habits left it abandoned. For decades it had stood empty, its ornate plasterwork crumbling, its once grand auditorium home only to pigeons and memories. Lawrence had purchased the building 5 years ago, using his own funds rather than company resources, with the dream of restoring it as a community art center. The restoration had been a labor of love, undertaken in between more profitable projects, with special attention paid to preserving both its architectural significance and acknowledging its complex history, including the fact that it had been built largely by enslaved craftsmen whose names had been deliberately omitted from historical records. Now, as the sun began to set over Charleston, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Lawrence stood on the theater's stage. The restoration was nearly complete. The plasterwork had been repaired using traditional techniques. The seats had been reupholstered in rich burgundy velvet. The chandelier, cleaned crystal by crystal, cast a warm glow over the empty auditorium. The scent of lemon oil and fresh paint hung in the air, mingling with the building's older smells: aged wood, the faint mustiness of spaces long enclosed, the indefinable essence of history itself. From somewhere in the wings came the sound of footsteps, and then Richard Coleman emerged, the same Richard Coleman who had called Lawrence to the stage at the Gala 3 weeks ago. "Lawrence," Richard said, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting me here." The two men shook hands, their greeting formal but not unfriendly. Richard was in his 70s, his hair completely white now, his face lined with age but his blue eyes still sharp. As president of the Palmetto Historical Society, he represented the old guard of Charleston preservation, respected, connected, and traditionally minded. "This place is remarkable," Richard said, gazing around the theater. "I remember coming here as a boy to see films. Never thought I'd see it restored to its original glory." "Not quite its original glory," Lawrence replied. "We found evidence of elaborate gilding that would have been part of the original decor, but it would have been prohibitively expensive to recreate. Preservation always involves compromise." Richard nodded, understanding the subtext. Preservation was indeed about choices: what to keep, what to alter, what stories to tell about the past, and which to leave untold. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked to meet," Richard said, moving to sit in one of the front row seats. Lawrence joined him, the velvet cool and smooth beneath his hands. "I have some idea," Lawrence replied. "The Society's board meeting is tomorrow. I assume there's been discussion about rescinding my donation in light of recent events." Richard looked surprised. "Actually, no. Your donation was given in good faith and accepted in the same spirit. The Society has no intention of returning it or asking you to withdraw it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What the board is discussing is the future, whether to invite you to become a board member as was originally planned before." Everything happened. The chandelier light caught the dust particles floating between them, creating a sort of shimmering curtain that separated and connected them simultaneously. "I see," Lawrence said. "And you're here to gauge whether I would accept such an invitation, or if the relationship has been too damaged." Richard shook his head. "I'm here to tell you that I will be recommending your appointment regardless of what others on the board might prefer, and to ask for your help in making that appointment meaningful rather than merely symbolic." Lawrence studied the older man, searching for hidden motives but finding what appeared to be genuine conviction. "You surprised me at the gala, Richard. You were the only one who spoke up, who acknowledged me as a legitimate guest and donor." Richard's expression grew somber. "Don't give me too much credit, Lawrence. I didn't stop Eleanor from confronting you in the first place. I saw what was happening and hesitated, chose protocol over direct intervention." He sighed heavily. "I've been part of Charleston society my entire life. I've seen these incidents more times than I care to admit. Usually, I've looked the other way, told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." "What's different now?" Lawrence asked. "Maybe I'm finally old enough to care more about doing what's right than what's expected," Richard replied with a small smile that quickly faded. "Or maybe seeing it happen to someone I respect, someone whose work I've admired for years, made it impossible to pretend it was justified or understandable." Lawrence considered this. "The board won't be happy with your recommendation. I've become controversial. Eleanor has her inclusion committee, but from what I hear, many of your donors are pressuring the society to distance itself from me." "Some are," Richard acknowledged. "Others are reassessing their own behaviors and beliefs. Change doesn't happen all at once, Lawrence. But it doesn't happen at all without a catalyst." He gestured around the theater. "You understand that better than most. Restoration isn't about returning to the past. It's about carrying the best of the past forward into a new era." The metaphor wasn't lost on Lawrence. What was happening in Charleston in the wake of the Gala incident wasn't destruction but renovation, a painful but necessary process of examining structural flaws, removing damaged elements, and creating something stronger in their place. "If I were to accept a board position," Lawrence said carefully, "I wouldn't be a silent partner. I would push for substantive changes, not just in who gets invited to galas, but in how we document and present Charleston's history, whose contributions we recognize, which buildings we prioritize for preservation." "I'm counting on it," Richard replied. "The society has been too insular for too long. We've preserved a sanitized version of history that omits too many voices and experiences." He stood, straightening his jacket. "The vote is tomorrow afternoon. I can't guarantee the outcome, but regardless of what the board decides, I want you to know that you have allies within the society, people who recognize that true preservation must include everyone's history." As Richard prepared to leave, Lawrence rose as well. "Why here?" he asked, gesturing to the theater around them. "Why did you want to meet in this space specifically?" Richard looked around the grand old theater, taking in the loving restoration that had breathed new life into a forgotten landmark. "Because what you've done here represents the best of preservation. You've honored the original beauty of this place while acknowledging its complex history. You've created something that connects the past to the present in a meaningful way. He met Lawrence's eyes directly. That's what the society should be doing, what we must do if we want to remain relevant and ethical in the modern world. After Richard left, Lawrence remained in the theater, sitting alone in the dimly lit auditorium. The building settled around him with occasional creaks and sighs, the sounds of an old structure adapting to new purposes. Through the high windows, he could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had shone over Charleston for centuries. Over prosperity and poverty, freedom and enslavement, progress and resistance. Tomorrow the board would vote. Some doors might close while others opened. The struggle would continue, with advances and setbacks, allies and opponents. But something fundamental had shifted in Charleston over these 3 weeks. A conversation had begun that could not easily be silenced. Questions had been raised that demanded answers, truths had been spoken that could not be unheard. And it had all started with 3 minutes. 3 minutes that had forced a confrontation not just between individuals but between Charleston's idealized image of itself and the more complex reality that lurked beneath the polished facade. Lawrence rose and walked slowly through the theater, turning off lights as he went, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, in this building that symbolized both Charleston's flawed past and its possible future, he felt a quiet certainty that had been missing since the night of the gala. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same dignity that had carried him through these 3 turbulent weeks. The dignity his parents had taught him could never be given or taken away, only claimed through one's actions and choices. The dignified response to injustice wasn't always silence. Sometimes it was standing your ground. Sometimes it was speaking your truth. And sometimes it was simply refusing to pretend that the emperor was wearing clothes when he was, in fact, standing naked before you. As Lawrence locked the theater's grand front doors behind him, the wrought iron key cool in his palm, he thought of all the people who had stood in their truth before him. From his great-great-grandfather who had created beauty with his hands while being denied recognition for his skill, to Walter who had declined a historic opportunity rather than accept limitations based on his race, to the young hotel worker who had risked her job to record an injustice she witnessed. Their courage had made his possible. And perhaps his would make possible someone else's in turn, a chain of dignity linking past, present, and future in a legacy more valuable than any building or institution. Have you witnessed a moment where someone stood up for what was right, even at personal cost? Or have you been that person yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire others to find their own courage when faced with injustice. Number 10. 3 days later, Lawrence stood at the podium in the fully restored Calhoun Street Theater, surveying the diverse crowd that filled every seat. The Historical Society Board had voted to invite him to join their ranks, though not unanimously. Eleanor's Inclusion Committee had already begun to implement changes in the Society's practices. The bank had withdrawn its demand for immediate loan repayment after a national business publication raised questions about possible discriminatory practices. The theater's grand opening had become something more than a celebration of architectural restoration. It had become a symbol of a community beginning its own restoration process, confronting painful truths, acknowledging historical injustices, and committing to a more inclusive future. On stage with Lawrence stood representatives from across Charleston's diverse communities, educational leaders, business owners, artists, activists, and preservationists. Among them was Walter, seated in a place of honor, his eyes bright with pride as he watched his former student lead a conversation he had been part of starting decades earlier. "Welcome to the new Calhoun Street Community Arts Center," Lawrence began, his voice strong and clear in the perfect acoustics of the lovingly restored space. "This building, like our city, contains multitudes, beauty and pain, achievement and exclusion, voices that have been amplified and others that have been silenced. Today, we reclaim this space not just as a monument to architectural heritage, but as a living center for all of Charleston's stories." As Lawrence outlined the center's mission, to showcase diverse artistic voices, to host honest conversations about history and identity, to provide opportunities for young people from all backgrounds to engage with arts and culture, he felt the weight of the past 3 weeks lifting. The battles weren't over. Change never came easily or without resistance. But something significant had begun in those 3 minutes at the gala, a reckoning that had been long overdue. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the theater's elegant lobby, enjoying refreshments and conversation, Lawrence found a quiet moment with Walter, who sat observing the diverse crowd with satisfaction. "You did this," Lawrence said, taking the seat beside his mentor. Walter shook his head. "No, you did. You chose dignity over comfort, truth over acceptance. And look what it's beginning to create." He gestured to the room where people who might never have interacted before were engaged in animated conversation. The president of a historically black college deep in discussion with a major downtown developer, young activists exchanging contact information with established business leaders. Eleanor Pinckney herself listening intently to a young historian discussing the contributions of Gullah Geechee culture to Charleston's heritage. "It's just a beginning," Lawrence cautioned. "Beginnings matter," Walter replied. "They set direction. They create possibility." He placed his weathered hand over Lawrence's. 3 minutes of courage can lead to decades of change. As the evening drew to a close, Lawrence stood alone for a moment on the theater's front steps, looking out at the Charleston skyline, church spires and historic buildings silhouetted against the night sky, streets he had walked his entire life stretching out before him. The city was both exactly the same as it had been 3 weeks ago and fundamentally changed. Not in its physical appearance, but in the conversations taking place within its historic walls, the questions being asked about whose stories were told and whose were overlooked, whose comfort was prioritized and whose dignity was compromised. A young woman approached, her horn-rimmed glasses catching the light from the theater's restored facade. Lawrence recognized her immediately, the server who had recorded the video that had changed everything. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice betraying her nervousness. "I'm Amara Jenkins. I don't know if you remember me, but I was working at the gala that night." "I remember," Lawrence said gently. "Your video changed a lot of lives, including mine." She looked down, then met his eyes with newfound confidence. "I'm studying journalism at the College of Charleston. I've always wanted to tell stories that matter, that make a difference. Seeing you that night, how you handled it all with such dignity, it showed me what courage really looks like." Lawrence thought of all the small acts of courage that had brought them to this moment. Amara risking her job to record an injustice, Walter sacrificing opportunity to maintain his dignity decades ago, his own parents working tirelessly to create possibilities they would never themselves enjoy. "Courage isn't always loud," he told her. "Sometimes it's just standing your ground quietly when the world expects you to move." As Amara headed back inside, Lawrence took one last look at the city he loved, with all its flaws and possibilities, its painful past and hopeful future. The 3 minutes that had changed everything weren't really about him. They were about a moment when truth broke through the polite fictions that had sustained inequity for generations. Such moments were happening everywhere, in ways both dramatic and subtle, whenever someone refused to accept less than the full measure of their dignity. The real transformation wouldn't happen in 3 minutes, or 3 weeks, or even 3 years. It would unfold over generations, through countless individual choices to stand in truth rather than hide in comfortable falsehood. But it had begun, and having begun, could not easily be reversed. Lawrence turned and walked back into the theater, ready to join the ongoing conversation about who Charleston had been, who it was now, and most importantly, who it might yet become. If you found this story meaningful, be sure to click on the video appearing on your screen now for an even more powerful narrative about finding courage in unexpected places. It's a journey of transformation you won't want to miss. One that will inspire you to consider how you might stand in your own truth when faced with life's most challenging moments.